Have you ever wanted to talk to your teen about alcohol or drugs but froze because you don't know where to start? Maybe you're afraid of saying too much or not enough, or you worry the conversation will turn into another argument. Today's episode gives you clear, calm, and practical language you can use, even if you've avoided this topic for years. Welcome back to All About You. I'm Dr. Shauna Watts, GP and women's health advocate. Back with me is Paul Dillon, founder of DARTA and one of Australia's leading experts on youth drug and alcohol education. Last episode, we explored what teens are actually using worldwide and how those substances affect a growing brain. Today, we're diving into the part parents find the hardest: how to have a real, meaningful conversation with your teen, and how to protect them even when you can't control every choice they make. This is general information only, not personal medical advice. Paul, you've obviously dedicated so much of your life to trying to protect teens. If parents focused on a few things that you think actually reduce harm, what would be your main advice?
I think the key is, it comes down to basic parenting, which is communication. I think it's about talking to your child and making sure that you keep lines of communication open, particularly during those tough times. And, if you have a daughter, that tough time is, around 14, year 9. That's where things can go a bit kind of pear-shaped for young women and young men a little bit later. But if you can manage, you can get through that period of time, and you are still communicating, maybe not communicating quite as effectively as you were, but you're still communicating. You're moving from a managing role when they're a child to a consulting role as an adolescent. If you can do that and navigate through that, and you are keeping communicating, you know what? You've got a better chance of, if anything does go wrong, they're either going to let you know or you are going to see it because you have a relationship with your child. If your relationship breaks down, it becomes much more difficult to, number one, identify any issues, and number two, to talk about them. But, my key message to any parent, and I can't stress this enough, if things start to go wrong, get help. Get help fast. Do not go, well, it's just a phase, they'll be fine. Get help. And that means, and I know some parents hate to do this for a whole pile of reasons, but number one, talk to the school. It's really important, because if you're seeing things, you want to know, is the school seeing things as well? So talk to the school and then get some help. I hesitate saying to most parents, go to your GP. What I will say is, do you have a good relationship with your GP? Does your child have a good relationship with your GP? If they do, go to your GP. If you don't, I've given enough talks to GPs over the years. And when I give a talk at a GP conference, pretty well every GP comes. Why? Because they know nothing about illicit drugs. They know drugs. They know very, very little. And so they just come like sponges. They love to hear about it. But most GPs I know, they'll say, I'll get a parent come to me and ask me for assistance in this area, and I don't know where to send them. I don't know, what to do. But if you have a GP who has a relationship with you, that's half the battle won.
And so, is there a time that it's too early to start talking to kids about drugs and alcohol?
No, absolutely not. I believe the minute you start feeding your child drugs, you should be giving them, you should be talking to them about it. My best example of this is, I can remember when baby Nurofen came on the market, and I was like, oh my goodness, how do you know your child has that much pain if they've got on Nurofen? But, if you're giving your child any drug at all, from a very early age, start saying to them, okay, we got this from a doctor. It's a prescription, whatever. Now let's have a look at the box. Let's have a look at what it says. How do we give it? The dosage says da 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 da, and there's a warning. Now, we don't use this as a 30-minute lesson, but you talk about what the dosage says. You give them the drug, and you say, now because this is a medication, we keep this in a special place, and do that. And never be a parent who says to your child when they're, 13 or 10 to 13, 14, and they go, I've got a headache. and you turn around and go, well, just go and get an aspirin, go and get a Disprin, go and get a Panadol. Because the one thing we want our kids to do is if they do decide to go down alcohol, illicit drugs, then you want them to have respect for that drug. And unfortunately, in the world we live in, particularly the pharmaceutical world we live in, there's a cure for everything. And I mean, there's cures for diseases we didn't even know we had anymore. So, when it comes to this whole notion of, well, pop a Panadol, oh, let's go and get some cough medicine or whatever. I'm not saying don't give your child medication. If your child is suffering, give them medication, but take that time to have that conversation, to learn to give them a respect for drugs. I was just looking literally 5 seconds before I came on to hear about the new SPAD report, as I said, that European report. It's really new. And what it says is that we're seeing the uptick, the alcohol's down, illicit drugs was down, vaping was up, but what was even more up was the misuse of pharmaceutical medications. And I think we've seen this coming for a while, certainly across the adult population, but now moving into kids. And so I think if you look at my website and my blog where I answer all kids' questions, I've had more questions about Xanax and Valium in the last 18 months than I've ever had before, particularly Xanax. There's a perception that if you get it from a doctor, it must be okay. It's and also it's better quality. It's actually medication. It's not going to be adulterated with anything. The reality in this country is that we've had a number of warnings over the last 12 months about Valium. It's adulterated with fake Valium, fake Xanax on the street. There's a lot of money, particularly in Xanax. Xanax is very, very difficult to get on prescription now. And so if you're buying it online, if you're buying it off the street, it's expensive, but seen as, they either use them in two ways that I understand with, because I couldn't understand how you kind of got a buzz out of a Xanax or a Valium, but essentially it's either using it with alcohol or using a lot of it and then trying to stay awake. So getting through and creating some kind of dissociation or euphoria, trying to resist that sedation. But I think, once again, if we had parents from a very early age educating and giving that respect to drugs, to medication, I think it would, flick across to other things.
I absolutely love that piece of advice. But what about the parents who are maybe listening and going, oh, damn, I didn't do that. I didn't explain the cough mixture. I just send them to the cupboard to grab a Panadol when they've got, a sore tummy or a sore head. So what do they do and how do they approach this? I mean, I'm not a great fan of having the big sit down, intense conversation in one go, because I'm not sure that that's a great idea. And I think it tends to make people shut down in any facet of life. But what would you suggest that parents do if they maybe haven't perhaps done those little baby steps that you've suggested that probably would work so well, but maybe it's a bit late now, they haven't done it before?
I think you're absolutely right. The evidence about sit-down chats is that they don't work particularly well for a number of different reasons. So I think this should be a gradual thing. The advice I used to give to parents was, if you've missed that opportunity there, and look for opportunities with stories on the news, in TV or movies where something pops up, and you just kind of. I would always say to parents, the key to have a conversation with your child in this area is never ask them about what they're doing. Ask them about what their friends are doing. So, what do your friends think of that? That was a really and it worked a lot around vaping, for example. You could find a lot about what was happening in a school, in a peer group, by saying, "Oh, what do your friends think? Do you have any of your friends who actually, think that's a cool thing to do?" Never ask them what they're doing necessarily, because that might not work too well. And you don't want to have too much information either as a parent, because you also have a duty of care to pass it on. I think that's it's about having those little bits of conversations with adolescents. There's a great book called what's it called? Staying Connected. One of the best books I've ever read for parents. It's a great book, and they talk about they list all these opportunities of where you can have good quality conversations with your kids, and of course, one of them that every parent knows is in the car. Number one, they don't have to look at you, and number two, they can't escape. But, don't use a car as an opportunity to kind of vent your opinions on everything. But just, if you've got a couple of minutes and no conversations happening, going, "Oh, look, I saw this story on the news last night about they've just seized another million vapes up the road." Are you seeing vapes disappear, or is vaping? You can do that kind of. Now, if they turn around and they say to you, "Oh, I don't want to talk about that," or something like that, don't push it, because it's no point. You're not going to have any success, not going to be any value to you. But I think looking for those opportunities is a way to go. And that's just not about, alcohol or drugs, it's any social issues, bullying. If you ask your child if they've been bullied, the reality is it's a very unusual child who's going to turn around and say yes, because there's a lot of shame associated with it. But if you ask about, is any bullying going on in your group, group of friends, do you know anyone at school who bullies? It's safer. And also gives the child an opportunity to, um, if they've got concerns, to kind of air them. And what you would hope from that is, if anything is happening with them, the door's open. You've opened the door a little bit. But yeah, that whole idea of sitting down and having the talk is most probably not going to work.
This episode is brought to you by my 16-week Rediscover You program, designed specifically for women navigating the challenges of perimenopause and menopause. If you're dealing with disrupted sleep, mood changes, or unexplained weight gain, this evidence-based program combines medical guidance, practical tools, and a supportive community to help you take control of your health. Women have reported significant improvements in symptom management of sleep quality and overall well-being. As an All About You listener, when you mention the podcast, you'll gain priority access for our next intake. Click the link in the show notes to learn more and join. I'd love to help you rediscover the vibrant, confident version of yourself. I've had a couple of parents message me with a few questions. So one of the questions was if they themselves drink alcohol and drink alcohol openly at home, they feel like, well, one of them actually said that when she tried to talk to her daughter about not drinking, her daughter very abruptly told her, "Well, you can't tell me what to do because I see you drinking wine every night." And so I think sometimes there's a hesitancy for parents to maybe say anything that's going to bring up their own behavior or reflect back on them. What would you say in that situation?
Yeah, I mean, I've heard that so many times over the years. Look, I think it boils down to one simple thing. There is adult behavior and there is, child behavior. Now, it's kind of, many parents have said to me over the years that, "Oh, I drink. How could I tell my child not to drink?" Well, most adults would have had sex recently, and no one's going to turn around to their child and say, "Oh, you can have a little bit of sex tonight." You know, um, Sexual activity is seen as adult behavior, and so you put a line in the sand. Parents are very, very, very hesitant to put a line in the sand around alcohol often because of their own use of it. I think you can turn around and you can very easily say, "Look, I drink. I'm an adult. It's my choice. And when you become an adult, you will have that choice. Currently, you're at that point where, I don't believe that you should be drinking, and I will not condone your drinking." Now, can you stop them from drinking alcohol if they really want to? Absolutely not. A child is going to find a way. If they want to drink, they're going to find a way. But that does not mean you kind of cow down and just turn around and go, "Oh, well, yeah, go for it." You make it as difficult for them as possible. But as I said, if you have a child who every single Friday night is kind of running away and not coming home till, Tuesday, you want to get them closer again. And so just saying no, 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 no is not necessarily going to work with them. So it's really, really, really difficult. But I think that whole notion that parents say, "Well, I do it. How can I say no to my child?" Well, you can. If you believe that And I think it's completely acceptable for a parent to say, look, I can't stop what you do outside of the home. I can't. But I'm not going to give you alcohol. And if I find out that you've been drinking, there will be a consequence. Now, I think that's entirely a fair thing to do. And I think it most probably works well in the vast majority of cases. It's about when you work out when your child is about to become an adult and actually move into the time where you believe it is safer for them to do it. And that's going to be different for every parent. Um, it's it's not going to be easy at all to because the evidence says very clearly if your child is going to drink alcohol and you want them to have good values, good attitudes towards alcohol in the future and be safer, then you need to be with them the first time they drink. That's most probably one of the most important things about their first drink, that they are with you when they first drink. You don't want to do that too early to preempt it, but you want to get it at the right time. You don't want their first drink to be in a park behind some bushes with a box of wine. You don't want that. You want it to be, where you can go, okay, this is how we do it. Here's the how in this family how we drink alcohol. It's very complicated, I think, and it's for every single person, every single parent. It's a different means a different response.
And of course, I'm going to ask you a question which is probably too specific and too general, really. But there are definitely parents who feel like when their kids are going off to a party, so they're, maybe in their teens and they've been invited to a party on a Friday night, they're kind of thinking, okay, I'm going to give them 2 drinks, 2 cruisers, 2 beers, and I'm going to tell them that that's all they're allowed, and it means that their peers won't kind of pick on them for not drinking, but that I'm controlling what they're drinking. But then, of course, it's the parents supplying the alcohol, and people seem to get themselves all tied in knots about that. Do you hear parents chatting to you about that as sort of a route they've gone down?
Oh yeah, absolutely, absolutely. It's look, one of the greatest problems that I think parents face is that kind of idea of if I'm going to provide alcohol, when should I do it? How should I do it, etc. And usually the line is, well, I only give them 2 drinks. The reality is now you ask any year 11 or year 12 student, how many drinks does a young person take to a party? How many parents are giving a 4-pack? And if you have particularly sons, it's typically a 6-pack of beer. It's far more than 2. What I did a couple of years ago is I went and I looked at what does 2 drinks actually mean, in terms of standard drinks, how much you're actually providing. And because the good news around alcohol, those young people who do choose to drink, is that they've shifted what they drink. It was when I started doing this back in the 90s. It was vodka, vodka, vodka. It was spirits that they were drinking. It's now premixed spirits. So that's good news because they're drinking, lower strength alcohol. But it's about how many they're doing, how many. Because I looked at a whole pile of different kinds of premixed spirits to find out how much alcohol you were really consuming. What it boils down to is that if you're giving 2 drinks to your child, you're really giving them really at the minimum around 4 standard drinks to take to a party. You're giving them a 4-pack. You're giving them around, 8 standard drinks. You're drinking more than a bottle of wine, about half a bottle of vodka. That's how much you'll actually get. And, I don't think there's any parent who feels good about giving their child half a bottle of vodka to, that's 15, 16-year-old to take to a party. So, that whole notion of having 2 drinks is you got to look at how much you're really giving them, which is really important. But basically providing them is not protective. There's quite a lot of evidence there. Great piece of Australian research, it's a longitudinal study, which is looking at people from 14 onwards. I think the people are now in their 20s. They found that of those young people who were provided alcohol, there was no protective benefit at all. No protective. In fact, if they were provided alcohol, they actually drank more. What that means was they drank the 2 they were given, and then they actually went and sought out more. And It's interesting. I think I've mentioned this before, but if you speak to a child and you say, "What did you learn from your parent giving you alcohol?" Every young person I've ever met who I've asked that question, they would have say immediately, "My parents trust me," which is fantastic. But then I say, "Well, what else did you learn?" And they certainly don't learn responsible drinking. What they learn is, "Mum and dad give me alcohol." And I don't think that's the message that most parents who do decide to provide alcohol want to do. But as I've said, every parent has to make their own decision in this space, what works for them and for their child. And that's really key. You can throw research into parents, say the evidence says, don't give your child alcohol. And that's fine if we lived in a perfect world, but we don't live in a perfect world. So parents have to work out, how do I handle this that works for me and works for our kids, works for my kids. It's tough. It's not easy.
One of the things that I've got 4 children, 2 of them are in their 20s now, but I had a little bit of an exit strategy with my kids where they would send me a text message that just looked like gobbledygook. So it looked like they'd literally butt dial text me with lots of Y's and things. And then I would always know that that meant they needed a call and they needed rescued because they were not comfortable in the situation. And in fact, it was used on 2 occasions, and I came in and I made a whole big excuse about why I had to bring them home. It was nothing to do with the situation. What do you think about having a pre-arranged exit strategy for your teen? Is that a good idea?
Yeah, I always call it an outward. Choose an outward, and choose an outward nice and early. I would say really you need your outward middle primary is when you kind of decide on it. What works best, I've got to say gobbledygook doesn't, in my experience, is not usually go down well, because what happens is that if anyone else sees their phone and they kind of know that something's up, and then you can get young people really ostracized for doing it. So I always say choose a name, use a person's name, a family member's name that they're unlikely to ever talk about. Choose it nice and early, and then the name can go in and it makes perfect sense. You know what I mean? But yeah, the most interesting thing about outwords is that, in my experience, they tend to become more useful as they get older. And what I mean by that is, I was presenting at a university once, and this girl came up and said, "Oh, you came to my school years ago, and my mum remembered you talking about an outword. We created an outword." She said, "I never ever used it, ever, the whole way through high school, but I use it all the time now that I'm in university." And it's just a word that and what will happen is that mum will give her a call and she can walk out of the situation. She said it. So and that word's incredibly important. As I said, a name works really well. So, Auntie Esmeralda or something, a name you're not going to use again.
Yeah, absolutely. And so let's say the parents have done the talking, but things have gone pear-shaped. They've got the phone call to come and pick their teen up who's very intoxicated. What's the next responsive thing to do? What should the parent do? Obviously, they need to make sure that their child is safe. They don't have alcohol poisoning. They don't need to go to hospital. But what's the next steps? When do they say something? What do they do?
Well, I think the in that kind of whole thing about lines of communication being important, I think I say in most of my talks to parents, you never let your child leave your house without saying to them, "You can call me anytime, anywhere, and I'll be there. No questions asked." Then, and I think that's the real key, that ... then. If your child calls you, and I've had a number of times over the years where a parent has been so desperate at the end of my talk to put their hand up and be proud and out and say, "Oh, I'm a parent who got called by my drunk teenager. They called me." So incredibly pleased that they were the parent that got called. They weren't the cool parent. Cool parents don't get called to these things. It will be the parent who everyone can trust, which is usually the parent who puts boundaries around. But when you go to pick them up, you put them in the back of the car, and if you've said no questions asked, you've got to live like that. So, take a great big piece of gaffer tape, put it across your mouth and sit in that thing. You might be as angry as anything. You might be upset, whatever. Don't say anything. Get them home. Give yourself some time to calm down. Make sure they are safe. And then wait until the next day when everything has settled down a bit to have that conversation. And I think the key to, these kinds of things, if your child, and hopefully most parents have created some kind of rules and boundaries around parties, whatever they may be, and around alcohol. And if your child has, broken one of those rules, pushed past the boundaries, and there needs to be a consequence. Now, I stress consequence, not punishment. A consequence, and as long as you've very clearly outlined beforehand what the consequence will be, then usually parents don't have much of a problem. So I always say to parents, the one thing you should not use is grounding. The evidence is pretty clear that grounding doesn't work very well, mainly because usually grounding is given in anger. What happens is something happens, blows up, and goes, that's it, you're grounded for life. And then you kind of got to figure out who you're punishing, really, because it's really going to be you as a parent. So I always say to parents, if you're going to create a consequence around alcohol, say, for example, your curfew time, you will be picked up at 11:30. If you miss 11:30 p.m., there'll be a consequence. Now, what that consequence is has to match the crime. So what I would say is around that, well, if you break that rule, then you're not going to go out next weekend, 1 for 1. And that works pretty well. That works pretty well. And if they're not allowed to go out the following weekend, you know what? They're most probably going to go with that because it's a simple one. But if you ground for a month, number one, you're never going to keep them grounded for a month. Who is anyone kidding? So, 1 for 1. And what I also say to parents, if you've got real challenging kids who are pushing all buttons all the time, ask them to create the consequences. If you say, here are the rules, and you've talked them through, they agreed with the rules, and say, what do you think should be the consequence if you break this? I'm always staggered by what kids come up with. Kids come up with things quite often far more severe than the parents would.
Wow. And what do you think about people removing phones? That seems to be a real favourite with parents, to remove people's mobile phones.
Yeah, look, I think because it's going to be so interesting going back to schools, in a couple of weeks, where I'm seeing a group of year 10s who, because they're 15, they're not old enough to be on, the social media kind of ban. What difference that has made. We're going to really start seeing that in the coming months. Look, phones, we know, are often the gateway to their peers. If number one, if you try to remove their phone for a long period of time, once again, it's becoming a punishment, not a consequence. So I think this is a great little trick. I haven't talked about this for a long time, but just spend, and you've got a bit of time when school starts, make sure that you have a week where you just watch when your child is on their phone more than any other time. And the evidence shows that it's pretty typically a set time for every group of young people. It's not the same for all young people, but particular groups tend to have the same time. So it might be between 6 and 7 p.m. That's the time that they're on their phone more than any other. Monitor it. And the next time, if they break a rule and the consequence is a removal of a phone, remove it for that hour. 1 hour, which is their key connection time. Don't keep it any longer than that. Because any parent who's removed their child's phone knows what happens. They hate you, the doors slam, you're affecting your relationship with them. Take it off them for an hour, then it's going to have an effect, and it's seen as fair. Now, if that doesn't work, then you take it for longer than that. But I think removal of a phone for a long period of time, most probably, as I said, is not necessarily a consequence. It becomes a punishment, and it's removing them from a gateway to their peers, which can be problematic.
Paul, I had a patient, a mum recently, who came to see me at an emergency appointment in an absolute state of panic because she had found some drugs in her daughter's bedroom, and she was absolutely beside herself with stress, anxiety. She was in one 15-minute consultation where I think we went on a roller coaster of from tears to anger to distress to panic, everything. I mean, she can't have been the first person to have had this happen. I'm sure you've had parents call you or approach you in exactly this situation. How would you manage that?
Well, I think, first off, one of the things that parents usually say after they found drugs is, "I don't know what it is." There's that great concern about what this drug is. Is it a powder? Is it a pill? Is it a capsule? Is it, a piece of paper? Is it some liquid? They often don't know. And of course, to some extent, how concerned you should be is also dependent upon what that substance is to some level. That can be very difficult to kind of identify. So that's an issue by itself. They might not even know what it really is. But I think if you're going to find a substance, something in your kids, you've got to ask, you've got to confront them about it. It's about, once again, sitting down, taking the time to kind of calm down, so you're not responding in anger or fear. You've got to take some time to do a little bit of homework, find out what you can, and calm yourself down. And then you've got to say to them, "Look, I found this. What is it?" I think you've just got to kind of ask them. Now, what you might find is that they'll shut down completely and not give you anything. But there's very little else you can do. Quite often, I've had parents who've said, "Well, do I take it to the police? Can I find out what the drug is by contacting the police?" and all that kind of stuff. And that becomes very problematic in a whole pile of different ways. So it's a really tough one for parents, that one, really, really hard. But I think the key is to be calm before you approach your child. And you've also got to be aware that you may never really get all the answers you want. Because you're going to be, as the common response would be, as soon as I found this, or what were you doing looking through my things? And, some of the ways that parents have found drugs that I've had contact with over the years have been completely innocent. They certainly haven't been, scouring through drawers or looking through things. I think, but you've got to. I always say to parents, when I get off the phone, as I get off the phone with them about this topic, is that you got to be prepared that you might not actually get the response you want. You might not find out what it is. You might not find out what they're doing, but at least you've been given some sort of like a mini alert of something is happening here. This is where, you go to a school and wouldn't necessarily tell them what you found, but you'd say, "Look, is anything happening with my child?" If nothing, there'd been no other indicators at all, you need to get some more information. But you may never get satisfaction with this one, I think. It's a tough one.
And you can often, I think, parents will describe being met with just a lot of defensiveness sometimes from the teen, if they're expecting, tons of apologies and admissions of guilt and all, they might be sort of sorely disappointed, to be honest.
I think the one thing that you do with this one is, and it's really key, if you are pretty sure that it's an illicit drug, then the one thing you have to make very, very clear at the end of this, and this can be very difficult for parents to do, but to make it very clear to them that the one thing you will not accept is any illicit drugs being brought into your home. Because, the reality is you own the home, and if an illicit drug is found in your house, then you could be prosecuted for that. And so, the one thing you will not accept is illicit drugs in the house. I found this, I don't know what it is, but it is being destroyed, whatever you're going to do with it. I wouldn't threaten with the police or anything like that, which so many parents do, or I'm going to get it tested or something like that, because it's incredibly expensive to do that, and finding a place that will do it would be very, very difficult. But I think the one kind of clear boundary you put around is bringing illicit drugs into the home is just not acceptable. If you choose to do this outside of the house, that is your choice. It's not something I want you to do, but if you're just meeting this wall, which is overwhelmingly what parents are going to meet.
Yeah, and it's very hard for the family then to try and rebuild that trust after a breach like that, isn't it?
Totally. And I think that's, you're most probably if there'd been no other indicators that anything is happening up until that point, you don't want this to be the breaking point of any relationship you have. Yeah, you have to express how you feel. You're not happy. You don't want them to do this. Whatever you do that, but you to attack, to kind of go at a child and say, yeah, this is um, you're just going to meet, as you said, a wall, and you're not going to get anywhere, and the relationship that you do have will suffer.
Yeah, absolutely. Paul, I have talked you to death. Despite you having a sore throat and all the issues you've had, your voice has held up remarkably. I suppose I would love to finish our conversation. You've been doing this for a long time now. What are the sort of key takeaways that you wish that you could express to parents so that they can help navigate both alcohol and drugs with their children and teens as safely as possible?
Look, I've had a final kind of PowerPoint slide for my parents, any parent talk I give for many, many years. And it just says a couple of things. Number one, tell your children they're great all the time. There's always something. You might not like what they do, but you love them. And so, and particularly, we live in a world where young people are, we see stories about teen crime and all that kind of stuff at the moment. There's a lot of negative stuff about young people. There are great young people, amazing young people. And, it's one of the joys of my life, what I do, because I meet so many incredible young people. So tell them they're great all the time. Secondly, find a way of connecting and keep it, particularly during that difficult transition time. Find, an activity that you can do with your child. Might only be a couple of minutes a week, but it's not about length of time. It's about quality of time that you spend with your kids. And then finally, very importantly, we know that the best way to keep your child as safe as possible is to know where your child is, know who they're with, and know when they'll be home. Now, that's incredibly easy when you have a primary school child. You most probably know exactly where they're sitting in the house when they're in primary school. But when they, start moving into middle secondary around that year 9, year 10, it becomes more challenging. And that's when you do your detective work. You got to actually say, okay, my child says they're going to A and B. Well, I might have to ring up and find out if that's where they actually are. Sadly, most parents are going to be disappointed at some point because your child is most probably going to lie to you at some point about where they are, what they're doing. But that's about keeping them safe. And that, I think, is the key. Caring about them, connecting with them and being aware of what they're doing.
My 3 takeaways. You don't need perfect conversations. You just need consistent, honest ones. Teens listen more than they show. Your expectations and presence matter. Fear shuts doors. Curiosity opens them. Connection is the strongest protective factor. Paul, thank you again for bringing clarity and compassion to a topic that can feel overwhelming. If you find this conversation helpful, please follow All About You and share it with a friend. And as always, this episode is for general information only, not a substitute for medical advice. Please speak with your healthcare provider for personalised care. I'm Dr. Shauna Watts, and I'll see you next time on All About You.